I shook my head, and searched for the words to respond. Sad. I'm not sad. Completely disturbed and disappointed with the blatant stupidity of humanity. Yeah, that I'm guilty of. I retracted my hand, wrapping it once more around my legs, to close myself off. This was how I was comfortable, detached and curled up into a little ball of disdain.
But you see, that anger is a falsity. It's not what truly lies in your expression, in your tone, or in those warm, bleeding brown eyes.
He leaned in close, his nose touching mine now, and at first I was frightened by his proximity. However, the fear was quickly overshadowed by my primal need for him, my heart thumping in exhilaration, and hanging on his every word. I should have ran away, my head telling me to protect myself, but my mesmerized heart held me in his spell, as he spoke.
No, Bella, I believe you are a wise soul, very good at hiding your true emotion, yet all I can see now is a little fear, a hint of arousal and a whole flood of sadness.
Edward whispered, and again my chest tightened, restricting my inhalation, and I found myself panting quietly into his beautiful face.
I'm going to kiss you now.
Edward warned quietly. I nodded, unable to move, unable to speak, as the anticipation of his full mouth on mine fanned the quiet embers resting in my soul. He gently brought his hand to cradle my face, as he pressed his lips to mine, the contact heavy, against my mouth. He sucked my lip between his teeth, gently gnawing the flesh as I shifted to press further against him. His hands, slender and lovely, slid firmly against my back. He slowly pushed his tongue into my mouth, licking at my lips first. My breath escaped in heaving gasps and sending shivers of pleasure spiraling through my veins as the forest spun around me. I had kissed boys, I had kissed men, but I had never kissed like this. My entire body begged for his attention, and I willed him to discover the most intimate details of my figure. Please grab my ass, please touch my boob, please, please, please put your hand down my pants. I wanted him to completely consume me, control me, and devour me, the mental penetration a complete tease itching to be satisfied. It was just a kiss, but I knew in that moment that Edward Cullen would be the death of me. Edward pulled his lips from mine and chuckled slightly. He still cradled my face, his thumb tracing the lines of my lips, and pulling across the flush tissue, as his melted eyes spilled into mine.
Alice, it's not polite to stare,
he said, his eyes still holding mine. I looked up quickly to find her glaring. Her mirrored melted pools mournful as she smiled shyly before shifting her gaze to the forest, her legs swinging on either side of the branch, and her soprano voice once again engaging in song. Edward resumed his writing, joining in on the crooning, and I sat peaceful on the flat rock in the presence of choral angels, their darkened halo surrounding and engulfing me in blissful intrigue. I fucked Edward Cullen in the backseat of his Volvo before the week was through, then again in the library, and twice we had ditched class to fuck in the forest, the cool damp earth beneath us grasping at leaves as he pumped into me fast and hard, roughly gripping my hips in frantic need. We hardly ever removed much clothing. My pants around my ankles as he pressed me against a tree, slamming into me from behind, my palms scraping against the bark, each time more frantic than the last. I needed him, needed this liberation, escaping for a moment into my own dim little dream world. Edward made me feel important and beautiful, his gentlemanly nature reminiscent of the golden age of Hollywood, his demeanor rich in a sophistication not of this era. I admired them both. Alice, a musical starlet, her classic Audrey Hepburn ambience regal in her mannerisms. In the short month we had spent together, she had become like a sister to me, absorbing me into her life with open and encompassing arms. When I was here with them, it was almost as if my father had never been arrested. I could almost imagine he had never responded to that emergency call, never had to physically restrain that crackhead whore who had left her children locked in her car while she serviced a patron in his apartment. He had never been accused of raping her, the stupid fucking jury of morons accepting a drug-induced falsehood rather than a well-reputed plea of innocence from my father. The case had been highly publicized, my father, the big bad dirty cop, taking advantage of a poor single mother, forced into turning tricks, to make ends meet. Everyone assumed the worst, that my mother and I had been victims too, despite our adamant denial, but they saw our cries as just that, denial. Eventually I stopped correcting them, stopped talking altogether, and now, 3 years later, this is what I was: angry, bitter, and utterly disappointed with the brainless, imbecilic humans that plague this planet. But Edward was changing that. Edward was changing me. Edward was different. He wrote poetry in his journal, pages and pages of imagery, and run-on sentences, that flowed from one thought to the next. His uncanny wit and insight into the inner workings of the human brain were fascinating and completely sublime. He crooned old show tunes as we walked the halls at school, Elisa's arm threaded through one side, Edward on the other, a tiny cocoon of oddity, and no one fucked with me anymore. No one looked, no one whispered, no one said a damn thing. It was as if I had never existed, and this suited me just fine. I stood outside the Cullens' house watching a young man tending to the rose garden. His curly blonde hair stuck out from beneath his baseball cap, sweat dampening his white t-shirt and causing it to stick to his solid, muscular frame. Precariously chewing a toothpick, his chisel jarred as the stick bobbed between his lips, his shears clipped at the stems with crisp, clean cuts. I watched the blade encircle the thick green flow of life, and with a flick of the wrist the withered bud fell to the ground, a pile of dead stems around his feet. He caught me staring, and tipped his hat, flashing me a fluid, seductive smile as he waved his shears. I waved back, flashing him a shy smile as the door flew open. Elisa's perfectly put-together physique stood in the doorway. She quickly glanced at the man in the roses before turning her gaze back to me, and cocked her head to one side. Her jade eyes pierced right through me, sharp, cold, and calculating before quickly fading into a slow, sly smile. She engulfed me in her long arms, her lips against my cheek, and I heard her inhale slowly as she greeted me.
"Hello, Bella. It's wonderful to see you. Please, do come in."
Alice moved aside to let me into the foyer.
"If you'll excuse me for one moment, I need to speak with the gardener. He's entirely too liberal with his shears."
She stepped onto the porch, her hand grazing my waist as she moved past me.
"Edward should be in the sitting room,"
she said, her black Mary Jane stepping into the dark soil of the rose garden.
"Close the door behind you, please."
Her eyes were fixated on the man buried in the roses. I watched her profile disappear behind the ornate mahogany door as it slowly swung shut. Quietly, I walked through the bright mansion, the house familiar to me after a month of daily visits. Principal Cullen, as she had instructed me to call her, and her husband Dr. Carlisle Cullen were apparently loaded, their huge white house far from the highway, and located along a secluded dirt road. Nestled against an encroaching wood, the house itself was a contradiction to the dark forest. The light airy porch wrapped around the front, and the walkway was concealed by the massive rose garden, the bushes thick with flowers of all colors. The branches were slowly beginning to wilt as the October fog settled among the decaying, trodden leaves. Edward greeted me cordially as I walked into the bright sitting room, his pristine white-collared shirt crisp around his thin lanky frame, and tucked into his khaki slacks, pressed and creased to perfection. He took my hand in his, bringing it to his lips, and letting his mouth linger, his tongue slipping from between his teeth, to taste my skin. My heart quickened its pace as I imagined his tongue lapping at other, more delectable spans of flesh. His mouth spread into a wide grin as he observed my obvious reaction.
"Oh, my Bella,"
he whispered under his breath.
"Your racing pulse discloses your more lascivious desires. Do not fret, my love, I have every intention on indulging your every betrayal."
He ran his fingers through my hair, pushing a loose strand behind my ear.
"I missed you,"
he said, and I rolled my eyes. I never really knew when he was serious, always with the charade. I knew it was all a show, because I knew the profanities he growled enveloped in ecstasy, pressing into me passionately and furiously, treating me like anything but a lady. He was so difficult to read, a contradiction that I could not decipher. Sometimes I felt our time together was an answer to his boredom, my